So he's telling them they're not going to understand what he's going to write about.
Whatever you're going to read,
this is a real come-on introduction, isn't it?
It's not.
What follows, you are not going to understand.
Absolutely.
Yes.
So it's a sort of alienating introduction, you might think.
It has a certain charm, doesn't it?
Well, it's not unusual for these philosophers to be somewhat condescending to common opinion. That's relatively common. That they will tell you that most people have no idea what the world's really like.
Angie Hobbs, could you take that up and then move to this one of his central ideas, which is the idea of flux? But would you like to take up what James has said about this introduction?
Well, yes. I mean, I think he's also selecting an audience. We might think that if people write books for absolutely everybody, but I think he's writing in a style which he hopes is going to appeal to the kind of people that he feels will be best equipped to hear this. Yes, we're going to come back to this notion of the logos. As James said, it's often translated account, but as we're going to see, it has other meanings as well. And we're going to be asking, is Heraclitus talking just about his book? And people saying, you're not going to understand my book. Or is he going to be saying, you're not going to understand the logos, the sort of the order of the universe, which my book is about.
And one of his orderings of the universe was through this notion of flux, which we now throw around, take for granted and so on. It must have been extremely radical, new, foreign, difficult to understand then. Can you tell us what he meant by it and how radical it was at the time?
Yes, well, we've got the doctrine of everything flows, pantarei, and the notion that everything in the world flows like a river, and he compares the universe to a river. So what we have, the notion here is that either everything is changing all the time, or that everything is changing intermittently, or everything is at least subject to change. And there is, as you might imagine, dispute about exactly how to interpret it. What is absolutely clear is that it raises really intriguing questions about the notion of identity. Because on the one hand, you've got things like the river and fire, and an example he uses of a particular kind of barley drink, which you have to keep stirring so it doesn't separate.
Barley, wheat and wine.
Exactly.
So cheese and wine. Barley,
exactly.
Cheese and wine.
Exactly. So these are things that have to keep moving in order to retain their identity. So on the one hand, we have identities being created through flux, because if the river wasn't flowing, it wouldn't be a river, it would be an immensely long lake. The fire has to fluctuate. And in that respect, fire is a wonderful sort of metaphor for his notion of flux. It's perfect. The barley drink, you have to keep stirring it. However, on the other hand, you get problems, because at what point does something, call it X, change to such a degree that it's no longer X anymore? So at what point does flux not just create identity, but actually start to destroy identity? And then you can go further, and one of Heraclitus's disciples, Cratylus, did go further and say, well, actually, take flux to an extreme degree, and you don't just destroy identity, you can't form identities in the first place. So according to Aristotle, this disciple Cratylus said, well, Heraclitus was wrong to say you can't step into the same river twice. You can't even step into it once. You can't even name a river. And Cratylus is one of my heroes. Apparently he gave up speaking, and would just
Angie,
raise...
one of your heroes gave up speaking.
I know, a great ruse with students. He just wouldn't answer questions. He would just raise a finger because he thought words had no meaning and you couldn't name anything because there was no fixed identity. So these are really profound questions, and flux goes to the heart of them.
There was a philosopher around and about the same time, Peter Adamson, Parmenides, who was putting forward a theory which was almost the complete opposite. Can you briefly say that? I'd like to bring him into the discussion before we move on with Heraclitus.
Yeah, that's right. There's a traditional contrast which goes back to Plato. So the thought is that Heraclitus thinks everything is changing. Parmenides thinks that change doesn't happen at all. So James was talking about monism earlier, and Parmenides is the ultimate monist. He thinks that there's being, and that being is unchanging, eternal, and that it's impossible to talk about non-being, because if you talk about non-being, you contradict yourself. So that you can't even say that one thing is different from another thing, because that would imply talking about non-being. So Plato and other philosophers seem to think they need to steer a path between Heraclitus and Parmenides. To be honest, I think this is a little bit of a distortion, not of Parmenides, but of Heraclitus, because it reduces, I think, what is a more general idea in Heraclitus, namely the unity of opposites, to just this idea about flux. And if you only have the idea of flux, if you only have the idea of things having different properties at different times, then you'll be led into this kind of Cratylus thought that Angie was just talking about.
Does this link up with his Heraclitus ideas of relativism?
Yes. So
can you give us an example of what he meant by relativism?
He actually gives us a whole range of cases where opposites or contraries are unified in the same thing. And flux is one example, right? So he says the same people go from being asleep to being awake. The same things go from being dead to alive, maybe because things die and fertilize other things. But he also talks about relativism. For example, that we value gold. Donkeys don't value gold, but they value trash, which we don't value because they like to eat it. Another famous example is that he says seawater is simultaneously the purest and most polluted of things because it's poisonous to us but healthy for fish. The idea seems to be that from two different points of view, the same object has two different features, but it doesn't have to be only in terms of change or flux or this relativism idea. There's also more kind of intrinsic unity of opposites. We already talked about the bow. Another good example is a fragment which just says the road up and down, one and the same. And ancient authors took that to be a reference to the cosmology that James was describing earlier, that the elements change into one another in a cycle. And although that might be right, I think it's also worth thinking about the possibility that he just meant, look, think about a road. The road up is the road down, right? And it's the fact that it's going up means that it's also going down if you go in the other direction.
People would say that's obvious. Where's he getting to by saying that?
What he's getting to is the idea that in general there's a principle that explains the existence and in fact the perseverance of everything, namely that things survive by being in tension in some way. And so he picks convenient examples like the barley drink, right? So the barley drink, what he says is the barley drink stands still when it moves. That's what the fragment is. The point, and it's sort of like a salad vinaigrette, for example. So if you don't keep stirring it, it will separate and it will lose its identity, right? So the idea that identity is compromised by change, which is the inference that Cratylus draws, and also the accusation that Plato throws against Heraclitus in a dialogue called the Theaetetus. I think Heraclitus would say back to that, no, identity is secured through the unity of opposites. So think of the bow, think of the barley drink.
Can you take up this notion of the unity of opposites, James Warren, and develop it, please?
Well, we've got two kinds of opposition, I think. You've got some of the examples that Peter was just giving you were suggesting there's some things display opposite properties at one and the same time. So at one and the same time, seawater is both unhealthy for humans to drink, but wonderfully healthy for sea fish to live in. At other times you have oppositions like that of the river or other fragments where things display opposed properties at different times. And these are both supposed, I think, to give us the notion that that these kinds of differences in perspective are part and parcel of the nature of the world, that we shouldn't be alarmed by the thought that one and the same thing can display these opposite characteristics. In fact, coming, as he says in the first fragment, describing the nature of each thing and saying how it is, just involves us recognising the very fact that items around us in the world might display these oppositions, and that's just how they are. We'd be wrong, for example, to neglect the fact that seawater is wonderfully excellent for sea fish to swim in. Now, that doesn't mean we can go and live in the sea, because we're not sea fish, we're humans. But we should recognise that our human perspective is just one perspective on the world, and that world will display opposite properties according to different other perspectives that other animals might have.
So there's a wholeness about the way he looks at the world, isn't there?
Yes, absolutely.
Is that...
It's a wholeness that he's drawing our attention to, but simultaneously drawing our attention to the fact that we adopt a certain particular perspective on that world, given our human nature and so on, that's just one of the perspectives available.
Angie Hobbs, the word logos came up earlier, and it seems to be very important, if not critically important, to an understanding of Heraclitus. Can you tell us what he meant by it? From what I've read, there are several interpretations. So if you go through the several briskly and then tell us the one that you rest on.
Okay, so we know it's foundational to his philosophy because his opening fragment is of the logos, which is thus always uncomprehending of humans, both before they've heard it and after they've heard it. It can mean a rational ordering and unifying principle of the cosmos. It can mean human reason and the products of human reason, such as books, words, accounts, and so on. I think he means both. I think he is saying there is a rational regulating order or ratio to the universe which regulates the change, which regulates the tension between opposites, which creates, or indeed is, the unity out of these opposing surface tensions.
Of organising principle, ordering principle.
Exactly. We see the surface flux and tension and oppositions, but there is an underlying unity formed by the logos. However, because we're not completely disconnected from it, because we do contain within us human reason and the products of human reason in books and words and language and so on. So through perfecting our powers of reason, we can get a bit closer to the cosmic logos. We are, in a sense, a microcosm of the macrocosm, and this is an idea we're going to see the Stoics and indeed early Christian writers taking up. So there is a connection between what humans say and write, logos in that sense, and the cosmic order.